International outrage over the deaths of several foreign aid workers in Gaza. How will this impact the ongoing Israel-Hamas conflict? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Israel said its forces hit civilians in Gaza unintentionally in an airstrike that killed 7 foreign aid workers. An Israeli military spokesman said it will conduct its own internal investigation into the bombing. And in another major escalation of violence in the region, Iran and Syria have accused Israel of bombing the Iranian consulate in Damascus on Monday. 7 people were killed, including a senior commander from Iran's Revolutionary Guard. In Gaza itself, Israeli troops withdrew from the Al-Shifa hospital after killing hundreds of people, including patients, and leaving the medical complex in ruins. We begin with CGTN's Noor Harazin in Gaza.
Gaza Civil Defense Forces say more than 300 bodies were found on Monday morning in the Al-Shifa hospital and surrounding area, following the Israeli army withdrawal. Authorities said the bodies were laying everywhere in the hospital's yard, including women and children, while some of them showed signs of decomposition. Israeli forces allegedly burned parts of the Al-Shifa hospital, including the specialized surgical building, which contains 3 floors of operating rooms, intensive care rooms, and recovery rooms. The facility was considered by many the best surgical facility in the Gaza Strip. Palestinians claim Israeli forces also destroyed medical equipment and supplies, including blood pressure and ultrasound devices and X-ray rooms. Israel says it was targeting Hamas fighters. Ahmed Mohsen is one of the civil defense workers who arrived in the early morning hours. He described the scene.
The Al-Shifa medical complex is now completely destroyed. All the buildings were burned. A large part was targeted by the occupation forces and warplanes. As we were heading down the road, a number of martyrs were found, including their bodies completely decomposed. A large number were picked up from the vicinity of the Al-Shifa hospital.
One eyewitness, Hazem Abul-Auf, was receiving treatment for earlier wounds at the Al-Shifa hospital when the ground operation began.
We sat trapped inside the reception area for almost 2 days. Then the Israeli soldiers entered the hospital and moved us to the Prince Nayef building. We sat on the ground. The place was very bad and not suitable for living. Then they moved us to this building. As you see, we are sitting around rubbish. There is no food or water. My circumstances are difficult. My left hand has been amputated and there is no treatment. And I have a platinum compound in my leg.
Hamas described the Israeli operation as a genocide and called on the international community to take immediate action to enter Gaza to investigate. For its part, the Israeli army announced the end of its military operation in the complex and claimed that it was conducted without causing harm to civilians, patients, and medical teams. Noor Harazin, CGTN, Gaza.
To discuss these unfolding events, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Jerusalem, Amotz Asa-El is a research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute and senior commentator at the Jerusalem Post. Here in the studio, Andrew Parasiliti is president of Al-Monitor, a Middle East news website. From Virginia, we're joined by Michael Maloof. He is a former Pentagon senior security policy analyst. And from London, we're joined by Abdel Bari Atwan. He is editor-in-chief of al-Youm. Welcome to all of you. Amotz, let's start with you in Jerusalem. There's already a great deal of anger with Israel over the high number of civilians that have been killed in Gaza. Now there's renewed outrage from many parts of the world over the killing of 7 aid workers in Gaza. What are the implications of these latest killings that we're seeing for the war that Israel is fighting?
It's too early to gauge, Anan, and as you said in your report, the incident itself is being investigated by the Israeli army. There's no effort on Israel's part to deny that this was indeed an Israeli hit, obviously an accidental one, no one in his right mind would order this kind of an attack from which Israel has nothing to gain.
Andrew, what do you make of what has taken place in Israel with the killing of these aid workers? Israel says it's unintentional and that it will carry out its own investigation. It says it will carry out a transparent investigation. Is that going to assuage the anger that we're seeing over what's happening?
I don't think so. I think this is yet the latest incident in a number of tragedies that have happened in Gaza. You have over 32,000, many civilians, mostly civilians, women and children have been killed. We can start there. We can start with, also in your report, the attack on the Al-Shifa hospital and other hospitals, on places of worship, on the famine, on the destruction of residential buildings. So the international outrage that you referred to in the beginning is only going to grow. In this case, as our Israeli colleague said, the investigation is ongoing. I was struck by Prime Minister Netanyahu's apology, which had a kind of feel to it as like, well, stuff happens. Wasn't intentional, but, you know, we'll try not to do it again. I don't think any of that will suffice. And as you and I were discussing earlier, the killing of journalists, what was the number, 190
right.
at this point, who have been killed in this war. That's another concern of those of us who believe in independent media, believe that journalists should not be targeted, and that all steps should be taken to protect civilian journalists and aid workers and humanitarian workers.
Amotz, in the past, there's been a great deal of skepticism expressed over Israeli investigations into these kinds of incidents. Would it help in this instance if there's an independent international investigation?
Let me say before that, in response to what Andrew said, no one targeted journalists, and the journalists, the ostensible journalists who were killed were not journalists. They were Hamas operatives, and of the sort that we saw deployed during the October 7 attack. These are not journalists, and they certainly they have not been targeted. It's unfair on your part to portray it this way.
Andrew, a quick response?
I didn't say they were targeted. I said 190
you did.
journalists.
You did. It's taped. You did.
190 journalists have been killed. They're supposed to be protected.
Who calls them journalists? How do you say that they're journalists? What makes you say that?
Well,
who do they work for? The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Daily Telegraph. What makes them journalists?
They're reporting the news.
No, that doesn't make anyone a journalist. Do they work for legitimate news organizations like yours and mine?
Yeah, okay, so your point is 190 were terrorists.
This is propaganda.
We'll disagree.
You just parrot the same way that you claim, Andrew, that the majority of the casualties in Gaza have been civilians. How do you know that, other than that Hamas says this?
I want to move on. I want to move on to the situation at the Al-Shifa hospital. Abdel, Bari, Atwan, Israeli troops escalated the attacks at the Al-Shifa hospital complex. CNN reports that the hospital has been left in ruins and the complex was strewn with bodies, including at least 22 patients who were being treated there. Israel says it was targeting Hamas fighters who were using the hospital to attack Israeli forces. What is your response to that?
Well, I'm surprised to hear that, to be honest, you know, especially the word unintentional attacks, and always saying that Hamas is the member who they were killed by the Israeli. 33,000 Palestinians were killed by the Israeli. Are they all of them Hamas? And 100,000 were injured. Are they all Hamas? And 86% of the homes in Gaza were destroyed. Are they the houses of Hamas? You know, I think we should stop this nonsense and we should look at the facts on the ground. There is genocide on the ground, you know, and this, you know, when they bombed this, the cause of this charity, the charity sign was there on the 3 jeeps were used by this charity. So I believe saying that, you know, Hamas, we are killing Hamas, you know, Hamas, the Israelis are saying that, or that Hamas got only 25,000 fighters. So, but they are killing 100,000 or injuring 100,000. So this is the problem. What happened in Al-Shifa hospital is a massacre. You know, I had been studying, I got my master's degree from London University in history. I never seen anything like that in history, bombing hospitals and killing people and taking children and throw them out. So this is never happened by any occupation power on earth except on Israel. So let us be frank and saying the truth about this. And the CNN is not actually lying. It is not Al Jazeera, or it's not an Arab channel. It is an American respected channel. When they say that, why should we suspect these facts?
All right, Michael Maloof, let's look at some of the diplomatic developments over the past few days. The Biden administration, as we are all aware, abstained in that United Nations Security Council vote, which called for a ceasefire in Gaza, as well as the unimpeded flow of humanitarian aid into the territory. With that abstention, the resolution was adopted. However, minutes after that resolution was adopted, the United States UN ambassador said it is non-binding and that Israel is under no obligation to abide by any of the terms of that resolution. The Biden administration has also periodically expressed its concerns over the high number of civilians who have been killed in Gaza, but yet at the same time, it continues to supply weapons, heavy weaponry, to Israel. What do you make of it? Is the Biden administration here trying to have it both ways?
Well, thanks for having me. I think the Biden administration is very conflicted in this policy. On the one hand, they want to support Israel, but on the other hand, they want Hamas out. But in the process, they have conceded everything to Netanyahu and his cabinet to wage this conflict, and Netanyahu has picked up on that. If the United States was very serious about really clamping down on Netanyahu, they would have stopped the flow of arms, and as a consequence, that would have gotten some attention. But Netanyahu has already figured out that the Biden administration is going to go along with it simply because the Israeli lobby in the United States, particularly in the Congress, is very, very strong. And you hear support for Israel, but you also hear the clamor, especially from people like Schumer, the majority leader of the U.S. Senate, chastising Netanyahu himself and calling for regime change in Israel. This reflects something internally in the United States, that the United States, particularly the Democrat Party, as we're approaching the elections closer and closer, see that their primary support from younger people is diminishing, because it's the younger people within the Democrat Party that are against the genocide that has been occurring in the Gaza, and I might add, extending now into Lebanon and also to the West Bank. Yeah. So this is still unfolding. Netanyahu knows he doesn't have to bend to the whim of the U.S. and he's going to continue as long as he has the support. He has the support of the majority of the Israeli people right now.
And we're talking about the relationship between two countries here, very close allies, but it's also about the relationship between Biden and Netanyahu as two people, two leaders. You've written about this, and you say this relationship is deteriorating.
No question, very much so deteriorating. President Biden, Senator Biden, Vice President Biden has had a relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu that goes back decades. They have disagreed. President Biden is fond of saying that he signed a picture to Bibi saying, "Bibi, I may disagree with you, but I love you." Well, that love is now broken, and the tension has developed between
What are the implications of that?
Well, there are a few implications. I'd look at it two ways. One is what President Biden is trying to do is to say to Netanyahu, look, we want really three things in the war. What we want is that you mitigate a Rafah operation, that it should not be as extensive as may be being planned. Secondly, more humanitarian assistance and the ceasefire that would allow the negotiations around the hostage. They disagree on that. What I've written about is that's all very interesting, but on those issues, in the Palestinian state, by the way, I'm sorry. On those issues, it seems to me that Prime Minister Netanyahu has the support of his people. he has a pretty solid majority in the Knesset, at least at this point, as does not seem to fray. And I believe that President Biden's message, and I'm not denying that the tension isn't real over those issues, is also part of the domestic electoral political aspect of this war and how it's playing out in domestic politics. According to a Gallup poll today, President Biden's handling of the war is at 27% approval. It's going down every month, and it continues to go down because Democrats in particular are increasingly dissatisfied with his approach.
Amotz, I want to look at some developments beyond Israel in the region itself. We have this bombing of the Iranian consulate in Damascus. Both Syria as well as Iran are blaming Israel for this. Israel has not said anything about it. But I'm wondering, how great is the risk of escalation of violence in this region? And for Israel particularly, how great is the risk of probably Hezbollah entering into the conflict in a much bigger way?
Well, the risks are immense. Everyone is aware of that, but the dynamics have been ignited by Iran. They are a major inspiration of all the violence that is now raging across the region. Think, for instance, of the events in the Red Sea, where international shipping is being targeted by what is clearly an Iranian directive, and this disrupts the whole world. It has far-reaching implications economically, and this is all Iran's doing. The same goes for all the elaborate network of proxies that they spread across the region and are now deploying and are now activating. They're the source of all this mayhem. What happened yesterday in Damascus appears to have been part of this scene, and you're certainly right in your suspicion that it might further accelerate escalations, but it certainly isn't where all this begins.
Michael Maloof, how does Iran respond to this? I mean, one of the Iranian leaders said that these attacks will not go unanswered, but do the Iranians face some kind of a dilemma here when it comes to how they respond? I mean, do they attack Israeli interests? Would we see some kind of response like they did a few weeks ago when they sent those rockets into northern Iraq after a similar attack on one of its leaders? How big a dilemma is it for Iran?
Well, as I see it, they're going to act on their own time and their own choosing. They could even use Hezbollah to do part of the work, or there could be a combination. But you're right; they have promised a response. It's going to be intriguing to hear what Hezbollah Secretary General Saeed Nasrallah says on Friday, and the fact that a diplomatic compound, regardless of what countries and adversaries you might have, under international convention was attacked. And that now portends something even more serious for all diplomatic missions around the world, that if this is allowed to stand, they're going to be subject from now on, and all these conventions are out the window. So this escalation, I think, is going to be could occur very, very soon, and it could occur in quite a number of ways. But I'm told by people on the ground in Beirut that there definitely will be a retaliation. And in fact, some of them are even suggesting that the attack on the diplomatic mission was basically a declaration of war by Israel.
Do you see it the same way, Andrew?
Similarly, I'd look at it and try to understand it from the Iranian perspective as well. This is not an easy choice for them. Israel has successfully taken out senior commanders involved in the Syria operation. There were a number of attacks as well in early January that took out key Hamas leaders in Syria, in Lebanon, also another Iranian commander in Syria. So if you go back, this is a powerful signal that no one is safe with regard to Iran. Iran thinks both offensively and defensively. they have to consider a retaliation because of what happened, but they have to think of the costs of retaliation. Sure, they can say, we will retaliate, as Ayatollah Khamenei said today, but if they go too far in Hezbollah, Israel has shown that it may be willing to also go very far in its retaliation.
What about Amotz's point that Israel, at least Iran, has been using proxies to create instability in the region?
That's correct. I mean, Hamas is a proxy of Iran. Hezbollah is a proxy of Iran. There are Iranian proxies in Iraq that continue to complicate U.S. policy. And there are proxies of Iran running the government in Syria. So that's very true. And Iran's complications with regard to retaliation are that it does not prefer head-on confrontation, but prefers to work through other proxies. And one I left out, of course, is the Houthis in Yemen, which I have referred to over the years as a low-cost, penny stock investment by the Iranians with very high returns.
Abdel, Bari, Atwan, I want to get back to the situation in Gaza and some of the other diplomatic efforts that we've seen in the past few weeks. We had, of course, about just over a month ago, we had the International Court of Justice that said that Israel's actions in Gaza could plausibly amount to genocide. It called for Israel to cease these actions that could lead to genocide and also to allow humanitarian aid into the territory. And then, of course, as I'd mentioned, we had that resolution that was adopted at the UN calling for a ceasefire. But despite all of this, has anything changed?
I mean, it changed to the worse, to be honest. There is a famine in Gaza now, and the aid which coming to Gaza is very, very few, and no actually any action from the United States or from the international community to seize the situation there, to prevent this famine which is taking place. The other thing is, it seems Netanyahu is like the wounded tiger. He hitting everywhere, hitting in Lebanon, hitting in against Iran, hitting in Palestine, hitting in Al-Shifa hospital. So it seems the situation is getting from worse to worse now. And I believe the United States until now could not actually impose a ceasefire, did not until now support a ceasefire in Gaza to put an end to these massacres. Definitely, you mentioned in your program, in your introduction, that Al-Shifa hospital, 200 people were killed there, and bodies were decomposed completely because of the Israeli attack. So this is an intention, or this is the acts of a country which did not want to have any ceasefire. And I believe, the Israeli now failed to achieve their major aims in Gaza, which is destroy Hamas completely and to release the hostages which Hamas caught on 7th of October last year. So it seems we are getting the sort of more massacre going to take place in Gaza, and also to go and bomb the Iranian embassy in Beirut, in Lebanon. They want to drag the United States to a war with Iran. That's the most important thing. The Iranians were very patient. They were bombed several times. The general were assassinated in Syria, but they never reacted. But when it comes to the embassy, which is a sovereign place for the Iranian, protected by the Vienna Treaty, I believe retaliation could be essential and could ignite the regional war. So I believe the Israelis are playing with fire, and I wouldn't be surprised if they drag the Western world, if they drag the United States to this kind of regional war, which will be devastating by all means.
Amotz, there's been a great deal of focus over the past few weeks on Israeli plans to stage a ground offensive on the town of Rafah, which is in southern Gaza. This is despite warnings from the United States that we could see an even bigger number of civilians being killed. The United States hasn't called for Israel to stop what it's planning to do. It says we should look at alternative proposals, whatever those proposals are. There was an interesting theory which came from Jerusalem, from a commentator there, Daniel Siderman, whom you may know. He's been on the show, and he said he thinks that Netanyahu is now looking for an off-ramp. He doesn't want to go ahead with this Rafah invasion. He's looking for an off-ramp, and I think he's being offered that by the Biden administration putting pressure on him. Do you think that is the case?
I don't know. There's a lot of speculation, and clearly the continuing over recent weeks in which this has been up in the air on the one hand, but down on the ground, very little has happened. All this has been very enigmatic. But I would say you're certainly right that this is part of the broader picture of Israeli-American relations, and within that, the very complicated Netanyahu-Biden relationship that this panel has just discussed. And I will say about that this much. Netanyahu's mental predisposition towards the American political landscape, and specifically towards Biden, is that he is deep inside his guts, he sides with the Republicans. These are his buddies. This is where he feels at home, and this is who he hopes will soon, once again, lead the United States. From an Israeli viewpoint, I think this is reckless, this attitude, and it's a gamble, and I hope that we don't pay for it dearly in the future.
Michael Maloof, hasn't that always been the situation with Benjamin Netanyahu? He doesn't have to deal with the White House, whether it be Biden's White House or Obama's White House or Trump's White House. He can always go around the White House directly to Congress.
Mm-hmm. And he has. He has addressed Congress and not even visited the White House. I think that occurred during the Obama administration. Look, I'm beginning to get a sense that he will have some difficulties even with Republicans. And I'll tell you why. If you listen to some of Trump's most recent interviews, and he's going to be the Republican nominee for president, should he win, Trump in a recent interview with Israeli reporters, in fact, made them outraged by some of his comments about how about the concerns of the killings that are occurring, and what amounts to, in effect, an ethnic cleansing that's occurring there in that region, and they were these and Trump said we got, he basically said for Netanyahu to get the job done, but we got to be concerned about the loss of life. The other thing is that he is very much opposed to Netanyahu, because Netanyahu basically endorsed Biden and congratulated him on his 2020 election, and Trump has never gotten over that. Yeah. So there's a deep animosity there between the two.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.